this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. Please leave a review, and if you know anybody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. Stay tuned afterwards for our descent into the killing fields of the comment section. By the late 18th century, the British Empire was stretched thin. War raged across continents, and Britain found itself surrounded by enemies. Its North American colonies were in open rebellion. France, eager to see Britain weakened, had entered the war in support of the revolutionaries. Spain, seeking to reclaim lost territory, followed soon after. The Netherlands joined the conflict as well, turning what had started as an internal colonial struggle into a global war. Britain was fighting on multiple fronts, across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and beyond. Amid the chaos, one strategic position became the focus of a brutal siege. It was a stronghold that controlled the western gateway to the Mediterranean. Whoever held it dictated the flow of trade, the movement of navies, and the balance of power in one of the most contested regions of the world. For Spain, reclaiming it meant restoring national pride and dominance in the Mediterranean. For Britain, holding it was non-negotiable. The battle that followed was relentless. It was not a campaign of swift victories or decisive charges, but a slow, grinding war of attrition. The defenders faced starvation, ceaseless bombardment, and disease. The besiegers, though overwhelming in numbers, met an enemy that refused to break. The siege dragged on for years, testing the limits of endurance on both sides. The outcome of this battle shaped the geopolitical landscape for centuries. Britain's survival in this fight reinforced its control over the Mediterranean, securing its ability to project naval power far beyond its shores. Decades later, this dominance allowed Britain to seize Malta, control Egypt, and secure the Suez Canal, solidifying its influence from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Control of this single stronghold ensured Britain's continued supremacy at sea, shaping European conflicts, colonial ambitions, and global trade routes well into the modern era. The world that emerged from this siege was one where Britain remained the dominant maritime power, able to dictate the course of wars and commerce across the globe. It was a battle fought on the edge of Europe, but its consequences reached far beyond. Let's now experience the Siege of Gibraltar.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 32, The Siege of Gibraltar. From the 11th of July, 1779, to the 2nd of February, 1783. British forces, fighting 380 soldiers and 5 ships. Spanish forces, roughly 21,000 soldiers and 19 ships. The last great effort to reclaim Gibraltar ended in defeat, sealing Britain's hold over the gateway to the Mediterranean. The rock remained under the Union Jack, and with it, Britain maintained the power to dictate the movement of fleets, the flow of commerce, and the balance of influence in one of the world's most contested waterways. Every empire that challenged British naval supremacy in the centuries that followed would have to contend with the fact that this fortress at the crossroads of Europe and Africa was still in British hands, and with it, command over the sea that shaped the course of history.
Gibraltar, its name drawn from Jebel Tariq, after the Muslim general who led the charge into Spain, has been fought over relentlessly. Since the day the Moors first fortified its heights, at least 14 full-scale sieges have been waged for control of the rock, also known as Apes Hill. But it was the British seizure of Gibraltar in 1704 that reshaped the balance of power in the Med. This was no mere conquest. It was the moment Great Britain stamped its authority on the region, a declaration that would not be ignored. For Spain, the loss of Gibraltar was a wound that refused to heal. In just 3 days of siege during the War of the Spanish Succession, the British took Gibraltar, and from that moment on, the rock became their stronghold. Spain made its counterattacks, first in 1705, then in 1726. Each time, British guns and grit held the line. By the late 1770s, Britain was locked in a brutal fight across the Atlantic, struggling to crush the rebellion in its North American colonies. Then came the disaster at Saratoga in October of 1777. British troops surrendered, and the world took notice. By February of 1778, France seized the moment, throwing its weight behind the American rebels. Spain joined the war in 1779, hungry for vengeance, and by 1780, the Dutch had entered the fray. The British Empire now faced a global war on multiple fronts. The French and Dutch wanted to weaken Britain. The Spanish wanted something more. Gibraltar, the rock, had been theirs once, and they were determined to make it theirs again. Madrid saw an opening. Britain's war machine was overextended. Troops in America, fleets watching the French and Dutch. If ever there was a time to strike at Gibraltar, this was it. But Britain wasn't letting go. The rock was theirs, and the man commanding its defense was exactly who they needed. Lieutenant General George Eliot, a soldier with 40 years of war behind him, took command in 1777. He was as educated as he was battle-hardened. He had fought through the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. He had marched with Frederick the Great's Prussians and had taken part in the storming of Havana in 1762. Eliot demanded total discipline. He lived it. He enforced it. Eliot saw what was coming. He knew Gibraltar was a target, and he made sure London knew it too. Under his command, the Rock would not be taken lightly. The Rock was already bristling with over 400 guns, cannons, mortars, howitzers. By the time the siege was in full swing, that number had climbed to 663, more than the garrison had men to fire them. Eliot didn't just prepare for war, he changed military structure itself. He pulled Gibraltar's civilian engineers under his command, laying the foundation for what would become the Royal Engineers. When the siege began, Gibraltar's defenders numbered 5,380 soldiers and 760 sailors. They were outnumbered, but they weren't outmatched. The peninsula's northern approach, narrow, marshy, and a death trap for any army foolish enough to attempt a direct assault, made a land invasion a near impossibility, and both sides knew it. The real battle would be fought at sea. The harbor was Gibraltar's lifeline, the only way to bring in reinforcements and supplies. The British positioned their heaviest guns accordingly, ready to unleash hell on any ship that dared approach. 5 bastions ran down the spine of the peninsula, each one a fortress in its own right. The new mole was locked down with a defensive stronghold, and another fort stood guard at Point Europa, Gibraltar's southernmost edge. The Spanish guns covered most of the harbor, making it a gauntlet of fire. But Rosilla Bay, just south of the new mole, remained out of their reach. That sliver of safety would be vital. British strongpoints along the northern bottleneck gave them the high ground over Spanish positions, ensuring that any attempted assault would be suicide. The Spanish strategy was simple: starve them out, keep supplies from reaching Gibraltar while pounding the defenders with artillery day after day, grinding them down until they broke. To make it work, they needed total control of the sea. Spain put 19 ships of the line on blockade duty, stationed at Cadiz. More warships gathered at Algeciras, just across the bay, waiting for any sign of a British supply run. The first challenge to the blockade came in July of 1779. 3 British ships, fast and lucky, slipped past the Spanish fleet, bringing in desperately needed supplies. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Eliot knew better than to rely on luck. Even with the fresh supplies, he rationed food with an iron grip. The first to go were the horses. If they weren't needed for work, they were meat. There were small gardens within the garrison, but citrus was rare. And when there's no citrus, there's scurvy. The disease came in waves, gnawing away at the men. By September, the silence broke. British gunners let loose on Spanish troops trying to extend their siege lines. The defenders had no intention of waiting passively for their fate. Then came a breakthrough. One British gunner had an idea: short-fused shells that exploded in midair, raining death before they even hit the ground. And the airburst was born. It didn't devastate the enemy lines, but it did something just as important. It rattled them. The Spanish had nowhere to hide. London wasn't blind to the crisis. By December, a fleet of 22 ships sailed from Plymouth, escorting a massive supply convoy. Gibraltar wasn't the only target. Besieged British outposts in Minorca and the West Indies needed help too. On the way, the British struck gold. An undefended Spanish supply convoy. They took everything, swelling their own stores before pressing on. Admiral George Rodney wasn't about to let the Spanish interfere. Off Cape St. Vincent on the 16th of January, 1780, he tore through an 11-ship Spanish squadron. The larger Franco-Spanish fleet, sitting uselessly in Cadiz, did nothing. On January the 26th, Rodney's armada appeared on the horizon. The Spanish blockade broke. Their ships scurried behind the safety of a boom in Algeciras' harbor. Gibraltar was saved. Rodney's convoy brought enough supplies to last a year. He also delivered fresh troops, the battle-hardened 73rd Highlanders, while evacuating civilians who had no place in a war zone. For 2 months, the garrison ate well. Then Elliot tightened the belts again. No one knew how long the siege would last, and he wasn't about to risk running out of food too soon. Day after day, the siege ground on. Artillery thundered. Shells shrieked through the air, and men dug in deeper. There was no respite, only the steady, punishing rhythm of war. Then, on the night of June the 6th, the Spanish made their move. Under the cover of darkness, 9 fire ships crept toward the harbor, floating hells packed with destruction, meant to burn the British fleet alive. But the British were faster. Sailors sprang into action. Shore batteries roared. And as if fate itself had intervened, the wind died. The fire ships drifted aimlessly, useless, smoldering out in failure. But the Spanish didn't stop. They tightened the blockade, squeezed Gibraltar harder, and by the end of the year, the garrison was staring starvation in the face. Scurvy ravaged the men, until fortune smiled. A Spanish brigantine, heavy with oranges, was captured mid-run. For a brief moment, the disease loosened its grip, but the relief was short-lived. The Sultan of Morocco sided with Spain, closing off Tangiers, the last safe haven for British blockade runners. Gibraltar again was alone. And then came salvation. On April the 12th, 1781, a British convoy broke through. 100 cargo ships, guarded by 29 warships. The lifeline held. Furious at the failure to starve out the defenders, Spain changed their tactics. They turned their guns on the town itself. No longer just a military siege, it became a campaign of terror. Civilians, men, women, children, all became the targets, and their bombardment was relentless. In April and May alone, Spanish artillery fired 11,000 rounds every week. Walls collapsed. Buildings burned. The air stank of powder and death. At night, Spanish gunboats prowled the waters, their cannons spitting fire at the harbor, hammering the defenses while the garrison tried to snatch what little rest they could. The town was utter rubble. In the wreckage, shattered casks spilled their secrets, hidden reserves of liquor, and the garrison erupted into chaos. For 2 days, discipline collapsed in a drunken riot. Elliot crushed the disorder. A few of the worst offenders swung from the gallows, a warning to the rest. This was still a war, and order would be maintained. Another convoy slipped in during April, but by summer, the hunger returned. The siege just never relented. The Spanish tightened the noose. Their forces swelled to 21,000, and the bombardment never paused. Now they sought to finish it. Siege lines crept forward. Trenches dug inch by inch, bringing more and more of the rock into their artillery's reach. But Elliot struck first. On the night of November 26, 1781, under the cover of darkness, he unleashed over 2,000 men in a sudden, savage assault. The Spanish never saw it coming. After months of one-sided siege warfare, they had grown complacent, and their defenses were thin. The British tore through the siege lines like a storm. Dozens of Spanish guns were spiked, rendered useless. Ammunition stores erupted in fire and thunder. The night sky filled with terrible explosions. The Spanish lines broke. The garrison had bought itself time, and for now the siege returned to its grim, methodical rhythm of artillery duels. The first half of 1782 was a war against time, against hunger, Against the grinding monotony of siege warfare, reinforcements came in May, but so did bad news. Minorca had fallen. That meant more French troops, more guns, and more pressure on Gibraltar. Now a new commander stepped in. Louis de Balbez de Berton, Duc de Crillon. He brought 9,000 men and a plan to crush Gibraltar in a massive assault from land and sea. He introduced a new weapon, floating gun platforms. These behemoths, reinforced with sand, rope, and hides, were built to withstand British counterfire and bring Gibraltar's harbor under relentless attack. The floating gun platforms weren't alone. 49 ships of the line stood behind them, their broadsides ready. On land, 40,000 troops massed, waiting for the order to storm the rock. The final blow was coming. It should have been the end, but it wasn't. On the morning of September the 13th, 1782, the French battery ships opened fire, pounding the defenses. For 6 hours they stood firm until the British unleashed their secret weapon. Heated shot. Red-hot cannonballs turned the wooden warships into floating infernos. Flames tore through the fleet. Some ships sank. Others were abandoned in chaos. The grand assault, the moment Spain had waited years for, collapsed in smoke and wreckage. With their grand attack in ruins, the Spanish and French fell back on the only thing they had left: brute force. Day after day, up to 2,000 shells rained down on Gibraltar, hammering the British lines. Then came the final insult. On October the 13th, another British convoy smashed through the blockade. Admiral Lord Richard Howe led 150 merchant ships straight into Gibraltar, packed with supplies. Then, without hesitation, he turned his fleet toward Cadiz, daring the enemy to fight. The Franco-Spanish fleet took the challenge, and a brief battle flared, but the Allies lost their nerve. They limped back to port, and with that, the war for Gibraltar was over. Spain had sworn that the war would not end until Gibraltar was back in its hands, but war has a way of breaking promises. By late 1781, the war in America was all but over. The fighting dragged on, but everyone knew the real battle was happening at the negotiating table in Paris. When the treaties were finally signed, America got its independence. Spain reclaimed Minorca and Florida. The war was done. But Gibraltar, it was still British. Spain had staked everything on taking the rock, and it had failed. 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days. The longest siege in British history. On February the 2nd, 1783, it officially ended, but the scars would last a lifetime. The cost was steep. The defenders lost 333 men in battle, but disease took more than 1,000. Scurvy had drained them. Smallpox had ravaged the civilians, claiming another 1,000 lives. Yet through it all, Britain held the rock, and with it, control of the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. See, Gibraltar was more than just a stronghold. It was the foundation of Britain's dominance in the Mediterranean. Decades later, they took Malta. Then, in the 1870s, they secured the Suez Canal. Gibraltar had been the first piece in a much larger game. And so an island nation with no Mediterranean coastline became its master. By World War II, Gibraltar had become an unshakable bastion. From its airfields and its harbors, British forces launched operations that crushed Axis ambitions, pried the Mediterranean from Mussolini's grip, and cracked open the door for the Allied invasion of Europe. Gibraltar was never meant to endure. The Spanish were certain they would reclaim it. The French swore to tear it from British hands. But war does not respect ambition. War crushes the arrogant, shatters the hopeful, and leaves only the unbreakable standing. For 3 years, the defenders of Gibraltar lived in the shadow of death. They starved, they suffered, they buried their dead beneath a sky that never ceased to rain fire. The thunder of cannons became their heartbeat. The enemy was relentless, pounding their walls, cutting off their lifelines, clawing for every inch of stone. Civilians cowered as their homes crumbled around them. Children wasted away. Disease ran rampant. turning men into walking corpses before dragging them into shallow graves. And yet, they fought. Through the hunger, through the sickness, through the endless storms of shot and shell. When rations dwindled, they tightened their belts. When disease struck, they endured. When the enemy surged forward, they met them with fire and steel. They did not waver. They did not surrender. And when the dust settled, when the last cannon fell silent, when the broken armies of Spain and France slunk away in defeat, Gibraltar still stood, unshaken, unyielding, and thus the rock never fell. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comment section. On the siege of Vicksburg's, listener Sledge, S-L-E-D-G-E, wrote, "The South should have listened to Cantrell and fought a guerrilla war." Mr. Sledge, you're onto something. Guerrilla warfare was one of the Confederacy's most effective tactics on a small scale. Men like Mosby, Forrest, and even Quantrill wreaked havoc behind enemy lines, proving that fast-moving, unconventional tactics could be a nightmare for Union forces. If the South had leaned into that earlier, who knows how much longer they could have stretched the war. But here's where the theory hits a wall. Guerrilla wars don't just need fighters. They need food, supplies, and a civilian population willing to endure years of hardship. And by 1863, the South was already starving. The Union blockade had strangled trade, rail lines were collapsing, and Southern civilians were rioting over bread, not waving guerrilla banners. And let's be honest, Davis didn't have a country like France backing him, funneling weapons and gold into the fight. The British and French stayed out for a reason. A full-scale guerrilla strategy might have made certain regions of the South ungovernable, but it wouldn't have stopped Grant from grinding down Lee or Sherman from torching Georgia. So did the South need more guerrilla tactics? Probably. Would it have won the war? Probably not. The Confederacy wasn't just fighting Union armies, it was fighting the North's industry, its manpower, its relentless war machine. A few thousand men hiding in the hills couldn't stop the sheer weight of that reality. By 1863, the Confederacy was already bleeding manpower. The draft had been extended to teenage boys and men, old men at that. Supplies were dwindling. Even if Jefferson Davis had tried to shift the entire strategy to a prolonged insurgency, he still had a problem. Where was the food coming from? Where was the ammunition? Who was supplying these elusive bands of rebels once the main armies disbanded? The truth is, the Confederacy did try elements of guerrilla war, and it worked in small doses, but it wasn't a war-winning strategy. You can't ambush artillery. You can't raid your way back into Vicksburg or Chattanooga. And you certainly can't shoot and fade into the woods when Sherman is burning those very woods to the ground. So while it's a fascinating what if, the hard reality is that the South was doomed the moment its armies could no longer hold the field. The war wasn't just about fighting, it was about industry, logistics, and morale. And once those things were gone, no amount of hit-and-run tactics could turn the tide. On that same episode, OMO Ministries, O-M-O Ministries, wrote in all caps, "It was all a lie. It was the North that were evil. Still is." Well, OMO Ministries, this is the kind of discussion that gets to the heart of historical interpretation. I hear you. There's a deep-rooted perspective in some circles that the North, not the South, was the aggressor, the oppressor, even the villain of the Civil War. And if you're coming from a place that sees federal overreach, economic exploitation, or the devastation of Reconstruction as proof of Northern evil, I get why you might feel that way. But let's strip away the narratives and look at the cold, hard facts. The Civil War wasn't just about state versus federal power. It was about the survival of a system that allowed one group of people to own another. That's not a moral judgment, that's just the reality of what was at stake. The South seceded to protect slavery. Its own leaders said so repeatedly in official documents, speeches, and letters. Now, does that mean the North was some pure, noble force of righteousness? Of course not. Lincoln didn't go to war to free the slaves. He went to war to preserve the Union. there were plenty of Northerners who were just as racist as their Southern counterparts. And yes, after the war, the federal government stumbled badly in handling Reconstruction, allowing corruption, exploitation, and chaos to fill the void. But if we're talking about who was fighting to uphold a system built on human bondage, and who was fighting to end it, then history is crystal clear. Even though that may not be the reason the North entered the war, emancipation was a moral strategy weaponized during the Civil War. The Confederacy fought to preserve a way of life that depended on keeping millions of people in chains. The Union fought at first to hold the country together, but by the end, to ensure that slavery was dead forever. So was the North evil? No. Was it flawed? Absolutely. Were there moments of hypocrisy, corruption, and moral failing on both sides? Without question. But at the end and at the core of this war was one defining truth. One side fought to end slavery, and the other fought to keep it. History isn't about picking heroes and villains. It's about confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.